The courtroom air was thick with the weight of expectation, then shattered by a sound that ripped through the silence like a physical blow. Mark, the man just found guilty of taking their son David's life, let out a casual, almost smug laugh. It wasn't a nervous chuckle or a desperate sob, but a clear, sharp burst of amusement, as if the verdict was some kind of joke. Mr. Miller, David's father, sitting in the front row, felt something inside him snap. Years of grief, months of agonizing courtroom procedures, and now this. His face contorted, a primal scream caught in his throat. He launched himself forward, a blur of motion over the polished defense table, aiming directly for Mark. His hands, usually gentle from years of working in his garage, were now clenched, ready to strike. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Guards rushed in, chairs scraped loudly, and gasps filled the space. Judge Caprio, who had been watching with a steady, somber gaze, raised a hand. It wasn't a sharp, angry gesture demanding order, but a slow, almost weary movement. His expression wasn't one of immediate condemnation for Mr. Miller, but rather a profound, sorrowful understanding. He didn't yell. He didn't even speak immediately. He just raised his hand, and in that simple act, a strange calm began to settle over the pandemonium. Mr. Miller was quickly restrained, 2 officers holding him firmly, his body still trembling with rage and sorrow. He didn't fight back against them, his eyes still locked on Mark, who now looked slightly less amused, a flicker of something like surprise on his face. The initial moment of consequence was clear. A father's desperate act, now met with physical constraint. But the full impact of his actions, or the judge's response, remained unseen, hanging heavy in the air. In that raw moment, a father's broken heart echoed the silent screams of justice. The room, once a cacophony of shouts and shuffling, fell into a stunned silence. Every eye in the room, from the hardened lawyers to the tearful family members, was fixed on Judge Caprio. They all waited, motionless, for his next move, for the words that would follow this explosive display of human pain. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with a heavy anticipation of what justice would look like now. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The Miller family lived in a neighborhood that felt like a postcard from a simpler time. It was a place where houses had front porches, not just front doors, and where kids played street hockey until the last sliver of daylight disappeared. This was a working-class corner of America, built on the steady rhythm of factory shifts and Sunday barbecues. Everyone knew everyone, and a sense of community ran deep, like the roots of the old oak trees lining the streets. Mr. Miller, a mechanic by trade, and his wife, Sarah, who worked at the local diner, had built their lives around hard work and family. They believed in earning your keep, helping your neighbors, and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Their son, David, had absorbed these values like a sponge. He was a good kid, always ready with a smile, quick to offer a hand, whether it was helping an elderly neighbor with groceries or fixing a friend's bike. He played baseball at the park, volunteered at the animal shelter, and had a steady girlfriend he'd been with since high school. David was, in many ways, the embodiment of everything good about their neighborhood. Their routine was predictable, comforting. Mornings started with coffee and the local news, followed by the bustle of getting David off to his job at the hardware store. Evenings often involved dinner at home, sometimes a walk around the block, or catching a game on TV. Weekends meant family gatherings, potlucks with neighbors, or fishing trips to the nearby lake. These simple pleasures were their wealth. their comfort. The unspoken social codes of their community were clear. Respect your elders, look out for the kids, and if you saw someone struggling, you offered help, not judgment. Neighborliness wasn't just a word, it was a way of life. Into this picture, Mark had always been an anomaly. He wasn't from a different town, but he felt like an outsider. He lived a few blocks away, but never quite fit in. While other kids were playing sports or joining clubs, Mark was often alone or with a group that seemed to court trouble. He had a history, not of major crimes, but of minor disturbances, petty vandalism, loud arguments, a general air of disrespect that grated against the community's quiet decency. People tried to be understanding, attributing it to a difficult home life, or just a phase. But the unease around him grew over the years. There were subtle signs early on that something was off. A sneer when David won a local award. A dismissive comment about the neighborhood kids. Nothing concrete enough to call the police over, but enough to make parents pull their children a little closer when Mark walked by. These were the small, almost imperceptible cracks that began to form in the otherwise solid foundation of their community. David, ever the peacemaker, had tried once or twice to reach out to Mark, to include him, but was always met with a cold shoulder or a sarcastic remark. It was clear Mark didn't want to be part of the unspoken pact of respect that bound everyone else together. These were the quiet undercurrents, the barely audible whispers, hinting at the tragic intersection that would eventually bring David's bright life crashing into Mark's dark one. The cracks in their community, once subtle, grew wider as Mark's behavior became more pronounced. It wasn't just small acts anymore. It was a steady drip of disrespect that slowly eroded patience. David, with his open and trusting nature, often found himself on the receiving end of Mark's antagonism. There was the time Mark deliberately bumped into David at the local convenience store, spilling David's coffee, and then laughing about it, not even offering an apology. Another instance involved Mark spreading rumors about David's girlfriend, baseless and cruel stories that caused unnecessary drama and hurt. David, instead of retaliating, would always try to de-escalate, to understand, to find a peaceful way forward. But Mark seemed to thrive on conflict, on pushing boundaries. These weren't isolated incidents. Mark had a pattern of behavior that involved minor altercations with other kids too. He'd make snide comments about people's clothes, or their jobs, or their families. He'd leave trash in public places, vandalize park benches, and once even spray-painted a rude message on the wall of the community center. Each time, someone would try to talk to him, to reason with him, but it never stuck. He'd offer a half-hearted apology, promise to change, and then a few weeks later, he'd be back to his old ways. The community, always willing to give someone a second chance, found themselves running out of chances for Mark. There were times when the authorities were called, usually for noise complaints or minor property damage. The police would come, have a chat with Mark, maybe give him a warning, and then leave. Nothing ever seemed to stick, no real consequences that made a difference. Neighbors would talk amongst themselves, frustrated, saying things like, "He just gets a slap on the wrist," or "They don't take him seriously." This perceived negligence, or at least the lack of effective intervention, only fueled Mark's sense of impunity. He seemed to believe he was above the rules, that he could get away with anything. This growing frustration wasn't just about Mark. It was about the system that seemed unable to handle him. People felt unheard, their concerns dismissed. They saw a young man spiraling, and no one, it seemed, could pull him back. David's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, had even tried to talk to Mark's parents, but they were either defensive or seemed resigned to their son's behavior. It was a dead end. So, when the news of David's death came, it wasn't a shock in the way a random accident would be. It was a sickening, gut-wrenching confirmation of what many had feared. David's death wasn't just a sudden tragedy. It was the culmination of a long, painful pattern. It was the tragic end of a series of escalating acts of disrespect and disregard for others, finally reaching a point of no return. The community understood that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable outcome of unchecked aggression and a lack of accountability. David, the peacemaker, the kind soul, had become the ultimate victim of a system that had failed to address Mark's destructive path. The quiet whispers had become a deafening roar of grief and anger, all focused on the young man who had taken so much for seemingly so little reason. The community's collective grief and anger, already simmering, reached a boiling point after David's death. Every conversation in the grocery store, every gathering at the local diner, revolved around the tragedy. People spoke in hushed, furious tones about Mark, about how something like this could happen. There was a palpable sense of betrayal, not just by Mark, but by the perceived failures that allowed him to escalate to such a horrific act. The Millers became the focal point of this shared pain, their personal tragedy mirroring the community's broken trust. For Mr. and Mrs. Miller, the initial shock gave way to an agonizing wait for justice. The days blurred into weeks, each one a torment of memories and unanswered questions. The legal process felt slow, bureaucratic, and detached from their raw, immediate suffering. They had to relive David's life and his death over and over again for police, lawyers, and investigators. It was a constant reopening of the wound, preventing any chance of it healing. The trial itself became a grueling marathon. Every court appearance, every piece of evidence presented, was a fresh stab. They sat in the sterile courtroom, surrounded by legal jargon and procedures, while their hearts screamed for their lost son. The stress of the trial carved deep lines into Mr. Miller's face. Sleep became a luxury he rarely afforded himself. He'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction he'd ever had with David, every moment he wished he could have changed. He'd picture David's smile, hear his laugh, and then the image would shatter, replaced by the grim reality of his absence. He tried to maintain composure for his wife, for their remaining family, but inside, a storm raged. He felt a growing sense of helplessness, a gnawing frustration that no matter what happened in court, it wouldn't bring David back. Justice felt like a cold, distant concept, not the warm, comforting embrace he desperately craved. Discussions among neighbors grew more heated. There were arguments about Mark's upbringing, about whether the justice system was too lenient, about what could have been done differently. Some called for the harshest possible punishment, while others, a smaller group, spoke about rehabilitation, though their voices were often drowned out by the cries for retribution. The Millers heard it all, the whispers, the debates, the passionate outbursts. It was a constant reminder of their loss, a public airing of their private agony. They felt like they were living under a microscope, their grief scrutinized and discussed by everyone. The oppressive atmosphere of the courtroom only added to Mr. Miller's psychological burden. The cold, polished wood, the stern faces of the jury, the detached professionalism of the lawyers, it all felt so distant from the fiery pain in his chest. He watched Mark from across the room, trying to find some sign of remorse, some flicker of humanity, but often found nothing but a blank stare or a defiant smirk. Each time Mark entered the courtroom, a fresh wave of nausea would wash over Mr. Miller. He'd clench his fists under the table, breathing deeply, trying to keep the anger from spilling out. He knew he had to remain calm, to trust the process, but every fiber of his being screamed against it. The sterile environment of the court contrasted sharply with the raw emotions that threatened to consume him. He felt trapped, suffocated by the injustice, the endless waiting, and the unyielding sorrow that had become his constant companion. He yearned for an end, any end, to this unbearable ordeal. He just wanted David's memory to be honored, and for Mark to face real consequences for his actions. Then came the day of the verdict. The air in the courtroom was thick, heavy with anticipation. Mr. Miller sat beside his wife, his hand gripping hers so tightly his knuckles were white. Years of suppressed grief, of anger simmering beneath the surface, all came rushing forward. He had tried to be strong, to hold it together for David, for his family, but the weight of it all was crushing him. Every breath felt like an effort. He had clung to the hope that justice, in its purest form, would finally be served. He imagined a moment of closure, a quiet acknowledgement of their pain, a final step towards some semblance of peace. The jury foreman stood, and the words came out, crisp and clear. Guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a surge of relief that was almost physical. Mrs. Miller sobbed openly, burying her face in her husband's shoulder. Mr. Miller felt a tremor go through him, a release of tension he hadn't realized he was holding on to so fiercely. He squeezed his wife's hand, a silent promise that David had not died in vain. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe that the worst was over, that they could finally begin the long, slow process of healing. But then it happened. Mark, the killer, was still seated, flanked by his lawyers. As the verdict was read, a smirk slowly spread across his face. And then a low, guttural chuckle escaped his lips. It wasn't a nervous laugh or a sound of disbelief. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was a sneer at their pain, a mockery of David's memory, a direct assault on everything the Millers had endured. The sound cut through the courtroom's fragile silence, sharp and ugly, louder than any shout. For Mr. Miller, that laugh was the ultimate act of disrespect, the final, unbearable insult. It was a match striking dry tinder. In that instant, all reason, all societal norms, all the years of trying to be civil and patient, simply evaporated. The image of his son, vibrant and full of life, flashed before his eyes, then dissolved into the cold reality of Mark's sneering face. It was as if Mark was laughing at David, at their family, at the very idea of justice. It was a direct challenge, a taunt that went beyond words. A primal roar tore from Mr. Miller's throat, a sound born of profound grief and incandescent rage. He didn't think, he reacted. He lunged over the defense table, a blur of motion driven by an instinctive, visceral need to silence that laughter, to make Mark understand the depth of the pain he had caused. His hands reached out, not with a plan, but with the raw, unthinking force of a father whose child had been taken, and whose suffering was now being mocked. It was a breaking point, a moment where emotional pain overrode everything else. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward, lawyers jumped back, and the judge's gavel slammed down, its sound lost in the sudden uproar. Mr. Miller's face was contorted, tears streaming down his cheeks, mixing with the sweat of his exertion. He was a man pushed beyond his limits, a father whose love and grief had manifested in an uncontainable outburst, a desperate cry for recognition of his son's worth and the immense void left by his absence. He was restrained, but the image of Mark's laughing face was burned into his mind, the catalyst for his fury. He just wanted it to stop. He wanted Mark to feel something, anything, other than that cold, cruel amusement. The guards wrestled Mr. Miller back, their grip firm but not overtly aggressive. Even they seemed to understand the depth of his anguish. He struggled for a few moments, his eyes still locked on Mark, who had now stopped laughing, a flicker of something akin to fear finally crossing his face. Mrs. Miller rushed to her husband's side, holding him, her own tears soaking his shirt. The courtroom buzzed with a low murmur, a collective gasp of shock and understanding. Judge Caprio, who had initially raised a hand to halt the chaos, now lowered it slowly. His gaze swept across the room, settling first on the trembling Millers, then on Mark, and finally on the stunned faces of the jury and spectators. There was no immediate order for contempt, no harsh reprimand for Mr. Miller's outburst. Instead, the judge leaned forward, his voice cutting through the remaining tension, calm but firm. "Order in this court," he said, his eyes still holding a profound sadness. "Mr. Miller, I understand your pain. I truly do. No parent should ever have to bury their child, especially not under these circumstances. Your reaction, while unacceptable in a courtroom, is a testament to the unbearable grief you carry." He paused, letting his words sink in, then turned his gaze to Mark. His expression hardened slightly. "And you, Mr. Johnson," he said, using Mark's full last name, a subtle shift in tone that carried weight. "Your laughter, your utter lack of remorse at this verdict, speaks volumes. It speaks to a profound absence of empathy, a chilling disregard for the life you took and the suffering you've inflicted. You have not just taken a life. You have desecrated the memory of a young man and mocked the agony of his family." Judge Caprio then looked directly at the jury. "Members of the jury, you have rendered your verdict, and it is just. But let me be clear. Justice is not just about punishment. It is about accountability. It is about understanding the human cost of actions." Mr. Miller's outburst, while not condoned, is a powerful reminder of that cost. He addressed the Millers again, his voice softening. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, your son, David, deserved better. This community deserved better. And while no sentence can ever bring David back, this court will ensure that Mark Johnson faces the full consequences of his actions." The judge then called for a recess, dismissing the jury and ordering Mark to be remanded into custody immediately. As Mark was led away, the smugness was gone, replaced by a sullen, defeated look. The judge's words, delivered with such quiet authority, seemed to strip away any pretense Mark might have held, exposing his callousness to everyone present. It was a public shaming more potent than any gavel strike. Mr. Miller, still held by his wife, felt a strange, fragile sense of catharsis. The rage that had consumed him moments before began to recede, replaced by a profound exhaustion. He hadn't lashed out physically at Mark, but the judge had, in a way, done it for him. Judge Caprio had acknowledged David's worth, validated their pain, and publicly condemned Mark's cruelty. It wasn't a triumphant feeling, but a quiet, deeply personal release. Later, outside the courthouse, the media swarmed them. Mr. Miller, his voice hoarse, spoke not of vengeance but of David's life, of the gaping hole left in their family. He spoke of the judge's understanding, of how it had offered a small, unexpected comfort in their darkest hour. The judge's response had transcended the usual legal proceedings, offering a moment of true human connection. a recognition that justice, at its core, must always remember the hearts it serves. It was a long road ahead, but in that courtroom, amidst the chaos and the quiet wisdom of a judge, Mr. Miller had found a fragile, yet enduring, sense of peace.